Okay, so it's really a great pleasure to have Amelia back here. Amelia was a PhD student here with David and myself. And before that, she was my master's student at the University of Waterloo, who never met me in Waterloo, pretty much, because it was COVID. Anyway, but she did a fantastic PhD on repeated GEDI shots. And she got a dream job, actually, because when we started, David told us about GEDI, this amazing laser beam on the International Space Station. And Anita said, "Oh, that's so cool." And when she graduated, she joined the team. So you're going to hear all about GEDI and the GEDI team. So thanks so much for coming by, Amelia. It's always nice to see you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Keshav. Yeah, as Keshav said, I'm former PhD student with him and David in the Energy and Environment Group in the CS department and the Center for Earth Observation in the Plant Sciences. And yeah, now I'm doing a postdoc with in the University of Maryland with GEDI and NASA. So I'm going to talk a lot about GEDI and about my PhD research on measuring the impacts of tropical forest degradation with Spaceborne Lidar, aka specifically GEDI. But I was told I needed a kind of generic word there, so people who don't know GEDI yet wouldn't feel too alienated. And of course, this research is not just my research, but was also done in collaboration with the logo soup at the bottom of this slide and other folks. And I'm also going to apologize in advance because I just got to the UK yesterday morning, so I'm a little bit jet lagged and discombobulated. But hopefully this will be coherent, but please do feel free to stop me at any time for questions. I'm happy to stop in the middle. All right. So we start out, where I start out is with the policy landscape around degradation. So in response to the climate and biodiversity crises that we know about, there have been lots of repeated national and international commitments to reduce, halt, and reverse deforestation and forest degradation. We have the Kunming-Montreal Protocol. We have EU regulations for deforestation and degradation-free supply chains. And in all of these policies, there are two terms that come up a lot. Deforestation, so that's land use conversion from forest to something else, and degradation. And I'm going to talk a lot more about how degradation is defined. The short answer is it's kind of not, but roughly it's this idea that the forest is still there, but it's lost tree biomass or it's declining in health and function. And causes of degradation can include selective logging. So here on the right is a photo of selective logging in the Peruvian Amazon. You can see some felled trees on the ground, lots of open sky and canopy gaps from missing trees, where this forest would usually be quite shaded or closed canopy. Other causes of degradation are fires, or in the tropics specifically, fires, drought, fuel wood collection. There's also a type of degradation that we call edge effects. So this is the propensity of forests that are on the edge of recently deforested areas to continue to lose biomass over time, whether because of continued human incursions into an area or greater susceptibility to what might otherwise be natural processes. So again, wind, drought, fire, and so on. And in order to be able to support these international commitments, we have to be able to measure forest degradation, and we have to be able to do it at scale in a way that's comparable and consistent between countries. So the longest running satellites that we use to do this are optical satellites. And I think in the intro, we've heard a lot about different ones. A lot of this is Landsat based. And so we've been able to detect deforestation in this way for quite a long time because it involves relatively large-scale clearing. Degradation is more difficult to detect from satellites than deforestation, but we're getting better and better at detecting these small canopy disturbances. So we understand that, for example, in the Amazon, degradation appears to affect a larger area of land than deforestation. What that actually means for what's happened on the ground is maybe still unclear. So we can detect where it's happening, but it's just hard for optical data to quantify in any real way the changes on the ground that we're seeing. It's just giving us this yes or no, a disturbance happened here. So we have these huge uncertainties about the impacts of degradation. Global estimates of degradation-related carbon emissions range from 40% on the low side to 212% on the high side of the emissions from deforestation. And it's even harder to use optical data to get at anything about forest structure, which is what we're interested in for things like forest integrity and the Kunming-Montreal Protocol biodiversity indicators. And I think it's also worth noting that this isn't just a remote sensing problem. Repeat field data on disturbance and degradation is also difficult to come by because you need to know that a disturbance is going to happen in order to have managed to measure the area before it happened. Or you need to cover a relatively large at-risk area. And so partly as a result of all this, from a policy side, degradation is just much less consistently reported on or monitored than deforestation. And there's this big interplay here, like how we measure disturbance affects how we can define it, and then how we want to define it affects the types of things that we measure. So I was part of this report that was commissioned by the UN FAO, which is currently in the midst of a process to try and establish an international definition of degradation for the forest resources assessment process, which doesn't yet exist. And this is part of the work that we came up with. We worked on this comprehensive review of, well, what are the existing definitions of degradation from the academic literature, as well as within individual countries and at the international level. And I don't always do word clouds, but I thought these word clouds were really interesting. So on the left side is our academic definitions, and the right side is international policy definitions. And in the academic literature, well, actually what I should say is what's similar. Loss, everyone can agree we lost something. But what did we lose? So in the academic literature, you see these four interrelated terms coming up again and again. Biomass, carbon, cover, and canopy. And I think, so these are, on one side, these are sort of just core variables that scientists tend to measure about a forest. Biomass and carbon, this is what you would measure on a field site. But canopy and cover, I think those are quite interesting because those are sometimes measured in the field, but largely those are satellite remote sensing variables. Because when we think about what we're seeing when we look from above, this is some imagery of where we're watching deforestation happen, and the pink areas are where a forest loss detection product, Global Forest Watch, has found deforestation happening. What we're seeing from above is the canopy, and what we're trying to detect are just changes in canopy and cover, and that's what we're identifying as deforestation or large-scale clearing. And this is really different from what governments and people are asking us to measure, what their conceptual definitions and understandings of what it means for a forest to be degraded. So these definitions largely are not measured right now in a consistent way. But what are they asking for? You can see carbon and cover are there, but this is just a much more holistic view of what a forest is to the people and the animals that live in and around the forest. You see there's forest structure comes up, services, so a lot about ecosystem services, function, capacity, biodiversity. Soil comes up a lot in these definitions, which we were sort of surprised by. So that's completely absent from the scientific academic definitions of degradation. Is the soil healthy and fertile? Is the forest helping prevent soil erosion? That was a big part of why it was coming up in the policy definitions. And then you've got biodiversity and biological services. And just to give an idea of the difference between measuring cover and measuring structure and function. There's a common problem in disturbed forests, which is liana proliferation. So these lianas have, I guess, really expanded, especially in the neotropics, associated with disturbance and climate change. These are these fast-growing woody climbers, like vines, that are fastening themselves to trees with all these different fun stem adaptations you can see on the bottom there. And what's interesting is these lianas are actually in the tropics not mostly invasive. They're parasitic with host trees, but they're part of a healthy forest ecosystem. And in some contexts, they're called sort of forest natural bandage. They're providing, when you have light disturbances, they provide this like shaded, humid ecosystem that the young rainforest trees like and use to help regrow. But after repeated heavy disturbances, these lianas begin to outcompete trees and can take over the landscape. But think about what satellite optical imagery is going to see in these cases, right? This looks green, looks good, right? That's going to be complete coverage. You're not really going to see down to the ground anymore. But these forests are stuck in this state of stalled recovery where they still have short stature. They're missing this multi-layered complex canopy that these forests are known for, missing the habitat and niches that we would expect. So we want some way to bridge this gap. We have these international definitions that are really lofty, but we basically aren't implemented right now. About 20% of countries are reporting on degradation in any way. And between those that are reporting on them, they basically are not agreeing on what it is that they're even measuring or reporting. So you can't really compare those numbers at the moment. And so international guidance, meanwhile, for how you should measure it is things like this. All the biomass in the area subject to disturbance assumed to be emitted in the year of disturbance. Great. Basically just treats it like deforestation. And that's your guidance for how to implement these definitions. On the other hand, we have scientific literature, which is working at larger scale, but it's mostly just measuring canopy and cover losses. And a lot of these pantropical or global studies are basically, they're not doing that much better than just saying, assume all the biomass is emitted. They're more like, assume 35% of the biomass is emitted across the board. And that's kind of it. So into this mix comes GEDI, my sensor. I promised we would talk about GEDI. So I think a lot of people are familiar with it, but just to go through. Since 2019, we have this incredible new data source. GEDI is, well, not new anymore. We have this incredible data source. GEDI is a LiDAR system. It's mounted on the International Space Station. And with its beams, it's taking, oh, that's so pixelated. Okay, it's taking samples of the world's forests, and it washes each footprint location with a laser pulse, and then it measures this waveform return from the upper canopy, understory, all the way down to the ground. And unlike optical sensors, the GEDI waveform is interacting with the entire vertical structure of the canopy. So it lets us see even into these dense tropical forests. And by analyzing this waveform, we can derive canopy height, plant area index, and all these other variables. We can also model three-dimensional properties of the forest. So that's like biomass, for example, which translates roughly to carbon content. And also horizontal and vertical structural complexity, which we can start to relate to to biodiversity and these forest integrity indicators. However, key to the problem of measuring disturbance, GEDI does measure carbon and structure, but it's very difficult to use to measure change. It was designed as a sampling mission, with just these 25-meter diameter footprints. It doesn't cover every location on the surface of the Earth, and it doesn't have a fixed or regular repeat sampling cycle like lots of other satellites. It also has geolocation error, so imprecision about where exactly it measured on the surface of the Earth, which is quite unfortunate. It's about 10 meters off on average. The original 2-year mission plan of GEDI was specifically designed not to measure change. The idea was we're going to sample every 1 kilometer square on the Earth twice, and that's it. And we were just going to get a static carbon map out of it. But early on in the mission, and unbeknownst to the GEDI scientists, the International Space Station was raised higher in altitude to save fuel. And this meant that the GEDI sensor ended up falling into these orbital resonance patterns where it retraced its tracks again and again and again. And this wasn't noticed and they couldn't change it for quite a while. So this was very unfortunate for the Jedi group, and partly because of this, in good news, they got the mission extended for hopefully a decade, and it's well on its way to getting more complete samples. But we thought perhaps those repeat tracks could actually be a very valuable data source, because maybe sometimes a disturbance happened to occur in between those repeat tracks. And if we could find those lucky locations, we could start to really get a picture of before and after impacts of disturbance in a way that we've never been able to get at large scale with field data. So, oh, sorry, this is my picture of how it's just going over the same tracks again and again. And this, I think this animation actually was made partly by David. This is going to be a top-notch PowerPoint animation. So what we're looking for is cases where we've got this beautiful tropical forest. We have one GEDI footprint that measures the pre-disturbance state of the forest. And then sometime later, a disturbance event happens. Oh no! And it's detected by an optical sensor up here. And then a second GEDI footprint, which we're going to allow to be up to 40 meters away from the first, falls essentially right on top of that disturbed forest and measures post-disturbance. That animation really holds up. Here's where we started. We started out with all of the GEDI footprints. Here I'm just looking at the Amazon, but we did this across the whole tropics. So in the Amazon from just 2019 to 2022, there were about 100 million GEDI footprints that fell within the Amazon biome. And of those, about 4 million happened to fall within 40 meters or so from a previous footprint. And of those, just 13,000 happened to have a disturbance intervening. And that sounds small, but actually, like, this is, compared to previous data sets on disturbance, this is huge. And in our newest data set that uses the full first phase of the GEDI mission, we now have across the tropics over 140,000 samples, high quality samples from before and after disturbances, which is the largest and most spatially diverse sample of its kind. So a couple things I want us to just notice about this data set before we keep going. So just looking at the Amazon, you can see all those disturbances were really concentrated in the southern part. This is because that's largely where the deforestation and degradation is happening. But then the other spatial pattern you're seeing is that it's falling along those orbital tracks that we talked about. So you can see these samples are actually largely coming in long lines where we had heavy resonance.
And the rivers.
Sorry? And along rivers. Yeah, so the rivers are, some of that is going to be real degradation, and some of that is going to be an artifact of the optical degradation products, which have this consistent problem of mistaking meandering rivers with.
But it's also like a venue for where people can go
Yes.
from boats and actually the forest on the mountains,
Definitely.
right?
So some of it's real, like accessibility, like you'll see in some of, I don't think I have a good picture of it in here, but you'll see along roads where we've done like, more on logging stuff in the Congo, which isn't in this presentation, but we'll definitely see it like, oh yes, it is along the roads, here it is along the rivers. I just always want to put that asterisk on the rivers because some of that is not proper degradation. So in doing this analysis, we have 3 driving questions. The first question was, for me, whether this analysis would be possible at all, especially with the small disturbances that we were looking for. And the most serious concerns were raised in 2021 in this paper by Roy et al. And this paper said maybe this won't work. It found that in disturbed forests, which have these very heterogeneous canopies or heterogeneous forest structure, that geolocation uncertainty that I mentioned could cause variation in the GEDI measurements that could be as large as the changes that you're trying to measure. And so the paper isn't saying it's impossible, but it does say you're going to have to be very careful about using GEDI this way. If it does work, though, we would have some pretty exciting analyses that we could run for the first time across the tropics, asking how disturbances are varying across space and how they're affecting forest structure, as well as biomass and carbon. And also we could start to think about how different types of disturbances, like from fire, from logging, from edge effects, are affecting the forests in different ways. And the third question here, I think, speaks to a broader goal. So using GEDI, we're going to be limited to only measuring the disturbances that GEDI happens to sample while GEDI is in the sky. But for me, one exciting thing about this data set is this idea that we could be able to extrapolate from it. So we would be very interested in any correspondence between what Landsat sees and what other sensors and what GEDI is measuring. And I think also that this is quite interesting with Tessera, which we haven't started to explore, but whether we could start to look at a comparison on what Tessera is finding and what GEDI is seeing. And I think the study of this last question has been really, really limited, again, mostly because there's just so little ground data. There was one very nice but small field study that suggested, this is the FODEX project from Ed Richards' lab, for people who know that, that said maybe there is some relationship between what Landsat sees and biomass loss. But mostly we think just adding more data could go a long way towards starting to answer this question. So starting here, is it going to be possible to measure small scale disturbance? So for this, I'm going to give us a quick run through of the methods of how we're doing all of this. So we have what I'm calling the treatment group. This is what we saw in our animation. We have 2 GEDI footprints and we have a disturbance, an intervening disturbance that happened between them. And we want to evaluate the changes that we see in that treatment group against some kind of control. So one possible control is just a pair of GEDI footprints without an intervening disturbance. And this is most of our repeat footprint data. We saw there were like 4 million samples that didn't have, or that, where GEDI just happened to measure again. Let me see. Oh, yes. And what we see, so this is what that group looks like. On the x-axis, here's canopy height measured by the first footprint. The y-axis, canopy height measured by the second footprint up to 40 meters away. And what we see is, there is a good amount of variation here. So largely from this probably geolocation uncertainties and actual differences between 2 footprints 40 meters away, as well as noise in the data. But the first footprint is highly predictive of the second footprint. So we have this one-to-one relationship between the first and second measurements. But this is not really an ideal control group because most of these pairs are going to fall in those intact homogeneous canopies that cover significant portions of the tropics, whereas our treatment group lies entirely in disturbed forests. And as Roy et al. Highlighted, those have these heterogeneous canopies where we might just have much worse correlation anyways. So to deal with these differences, we added a disturbed control group. So these are going to be footprint pairs that fall in a disturbed forest, just like the treatment group, but the 2 GEDI footprints didn't happen to measure the disturbance. So they either both fell after the disturbance or they both fell before the disturbance took place. And when we look at, oh, I see, okay. Sorry. And so when we look here at, there's our treatment group in red and then a control group in blue. And you can see that now we have a spatial distribution that actually matches, where we're mostly getting footprints in the same areas where the disturbances are taking place and not from that undisturbed area up in the north. And so when we look at that group, as expected, we do have much messier data. Higher standard deviation, RMSE, lower correlation, but again, and critically, there's no bias. So the first footprint is still an unbiased predictor of the second footprint. Whereas when we compare the disturbed control to footprint pairs that did experience intervening disturbance, the differences are substantial. So this is quite exciting because it allows us to sort of formally test this hypothesis that our methodology is sensitive to the impacts of disturbance. I think what's really important to observe from this data is that the variance is too high to look at individual locations and say, yes, I know exactly what happened here, and I know what impacts the disturbance have. In some way, you have to look at some aggregation of these samples and look at this aggregation. But in aggregation, we have statistically significant evidence that GEDI is measuring biomass and canopy loss, even following relatively small disturbances. So these are about 10 to 30 meters wide disturbances. So this is quite exciting, and it means that we can move on, as you suspected we might be able to our second question. What were the impacts of disturbance on forest structure and biomass, and how did they vary across space and by disturbance driver? So what we find is that there's actually a huge spatial variation in the amount of biomass or carbon that's lost in a disturbance in different places across the tropics. So here we've divided our sample across these 250-kilometer diameter hexagonal grid cells. And what I'm showing is the mean carbon stock change that's associated with a disturbance in each of those cells. And if a cell is dark gray, it means that we didn't have enough samples of disturbance in that area to be able to measure disturbance, or to be able to calculate uncertainties on this, which could either be because it's pretty much intact forest, there's no disturbances taking place there, and GEDI rarely managed to measure them if they were, or it could be because the whole area is already sort of deforested, and so there's not a lot of degradation taking place. So looking at some of these hotspots where degradation tends to correspond to particularly large losses. So one area that immediately pops out is we see the arc of deforestation in the Amazon. This is where disturbances are starting to encroach into these tall interior forests. And that's where we're seeing much higher losses in both absolute and relative terms than either in other areas that have previously suffered a lot of deforestation, which would be more to the south and east, or to areas that haven't yet been kind of encroached upon, which is more to the north and west there. Another spot that pops out here is on New Britain Island in Papua New Guinea, down on that side. This is really interesting. So before 2008, this was a heavily forested area, basically all primary forest and very little deforestation. And since then, logging increased substantially. And right in the middle of our study period, so in like August of 2021, there was a big uptick in logging in that area. And at this point, about 10% of the forest cover on New Britain Island has been lost, and about 60% of that was in primary forest. So again, we're seeing this same story where when you get these incursions, especially logging incursions into primary forest, that's where we have the highest kind of per disturbance biomass losses. Yeah.
Just wondering if you know what's going on in the places where there's like a small increase in disturbance.
Yeah. So
it's just random, like not enough samples in those places, or whether there's actually something going on there.
This is a great question. So I think a lot of these are places that are very few samples of disturbance. So we put all of these into the average because we because that's how it works. So when we make a total, we are doing this. So you can see a lot of these are especially along hexagons that are border hexagons. Yeah. So that means that we didn't actually end up getting an equal area there. And so we have relatively few samples of disturbance. Some of them could also be noise in the maps themselves. So where you actually are seeing some regrowth, like if you're getting some errors in the underlying optical disturbance map. But I think a lot of it is noise from the sensor and variation that's happening in some of these hexagons. So in the end, those light green spots, I think that was, I'm about to go to the total disturbance losses. So our total disturbance losses, I'm trying to remember, I think it accounted for like less than 2% or something of the totals. Like the actual amounts there are quite small of growth. So from this sample, we can then extrapolate to look at the cumulative disturbance related carbon stock changes across the tropics. And actually, maybe to add to that, so on here, you'll see there's basically no green left. So when we actually add those up, they're affecting very small areas, and it's the means are just slightly positive, basically. So what we found is over this time period, disturbance in the Amazon contributed about half of the disturbance-related emissions across the tropics. I also think it's interesting that we have a slightly different story of spatial variation here. So the arc of deforestation and New Britain Island, both still, losing a lot of biomass to degradation. But you also see that's around Yaoundé, which is the capital city of Cameroon, which has been expanding slowly over this time. And so that probably was not interior forest. That was like slow expansion that year over year wasn't particularly intensive disturbance, but when we add up these totals, it comes out as this kind of clear cumulative hotspot of loss.
Yeah, just a quick question, because you were separating the degradation and disturbance, and
sorry.
Are these like actually now talking about like all of them together, both the degradation and disturbance?
Yes, okay. I'm very maybe from having spent too long in the definition space, I'm very sloppy about these terms. So I have been using disturbance and degradation sort of interchangeably, which is bad. Some people say that disturbance should be sort of agnostic to the cause, and degradation should be about anthropogenic causes specifically. And I think about it a little bit as like, I think of disturbances as sort of like events and degradation as a state. But for this presentation, I'm unfortunately using them interchangeably as I talk quickly. So sorry.
No worries. I'm just trying to understand, because you used an optical sensor to kind of guide where to sample the GEDI. Did the optical sensors say, oh, this is a deforestation? You looked at both the ones that said forest to no forest and forest to forest, or just forest to forest?
Just forest to forest.
Okay.
So none of this includes deforestation.
Okay.
This is only things that ended up, and specifically we're basing this on the JRC map. So this is things that after about 2.5 years were no longer visible in the optical disturbance record. So we know that there was some amount of at least canopy cover recovery. And that's how we're understanding the deforestation degradation distinction.
Okay. Okay.
So a logging, like a big like fishbone of logging rows.
Yeah.
The main road often will stay, and then all the like fish bones will
Yes.
regrow really quickly.
Yeah.
So those show up probably as degradation.
Yes,
Okay.
and the logging road would probably be deforestation and wouldn't be included here.
Okay.
Even though you could say maybe that should be counted as part of logging degradation.
Yeah.
But we
That's
wouldn't
deforestation.
we would
Okay.
count that as deforestation. Yeah. I think one thing, certainly like this method you could use to, you can adjust what type of thing you're going to count.
Yeah.
Basically. So this is what we decided on,
Yeah.
but you can kind of adjust that as however you like to get when you get these totals. So how does this end up comparing with our understanding of deforestation? So in the Amazon, we found that this is comparable to estimates of losses from deforestation, depending on who you ask and how they measured deforestation. And this is kind of agrees with, so the Amazon just has a lot more data than these other tropical areas. And so a lot of these results that were coming out of the Amazon were saying it looks like degradation is comparable in carbon emissions to deforestation. And we found that appeared to be somewhat true in the Amazon, but at least when we looked across the entire tropics, degradation was a much smaller contributor to carbon emissions than the estimates that are coming from deforestation. Since you're working with the FAO data, one thing that we found was very interesting is the FAO data, the studies that come out of the FAO data find huge carbon losses that at least like these optical records that are more like bottom up, what can we detect, are not matching. So I think there's like also huge uncertainties. Honestly, I think what I was surprised by is that even in the deforestation numbers, there are huge uncertainties, depending on whether you're doing a bottom-up accounting or this like top-down every country report you're losses accounting. Though the FAO numbers are also trying to account for like end fate of wood products and things like that the bottom up accounting isn't. So, but yeah, very high discrepancies. I think one thing that's interesting is that as well, when we compared this with what previous studies and field-based studies found, mostly this was comparing with studies in the Amazon, where, like I said, there is a lot of data. We found that compared to other satellite-based studies in the Amazon, a lot of those report really high degradation losses, so like 200 teragrams of carbon per year. And we found that it was much lower than that, so more like 50 teragrams per year. A lot of these studies are often comparing disturbed areas to undisturbed areas, and that's how they're getting their loss accounting, as opposed to saying, well, what was it before and what was it after? And so I think some of that is maybe inflating these numbers. When we compared to, there's some LiDAR data in the Amazon that's before and after LiDAR, and we found much closer agreement with that kind of data. So I think there's a lot going on in what existing satellite studies are saying and their methodologies, and maybe inflating these numbers to some extent. At the same time, our numbers are probably, because we're relying on the optical disturbance record to find disturbances, it's probably missing
All the edge effects.
Oh, yes. Well, okay. So edge effects are interesting. In fact, let's go to that. So now look how many graphs I've got for you. So we also wanted to go further than carbon, and look at structural changes in these forests. So here I'm showing structural complexity based on GEDI. This is high values here means more complex forests. And I've split this out by 3 disturbance types: fire, selective logging, and then edge effects. So fire is red, selective logging is purple, and edge effects in green. So what we can look at is not just what happens, what the forests look like after the disturbance, but also what forests that are later disturbed look like, right? So on the top here, on the left, we have, here's the complexity prior to disturbance, and then on the right, the complexity after disturbance. And so in each of the 3 regions, we find that, so each of the 3 continents, we find that fire is just causing the greatest losses, as you might expect. Larger structural complexity losses, larger carbon losses than either selective logging or edge effects. So down here, this is the change in structural complexity index. So there's that line 0, that means there's basically no change between the first and second footprint. And then how far the distribution tends to the left of that line is how much complexity loss there is. As you can see, like the fire losses are much more to the left than these other ones. That said, selective logging, so that light purple line there is selective logging in Asia and Oceania. You can see that ends up, look, the structural complexity losses there look quite a lot like fire. I mean, these are really intensive disturbances. We think, again, this is driven by what we were seeing in Papua New Guinea, where we captured some very intensive logging during these periods. The thing that I think is interesting, though, is that with fire, the burned forests are also the least complex before the disturbance even happens. So fires are mostly taking place in these low complexity fragmented forests, whereas selective logging, as you might imagine, like we call this high grading. So you're tending to take for it to cut in interior forests that have a lot of complexity to begin with. And so these, people had kind of seen this as well in the Amazon, and we're seeing it across all 3 continents. And the most complex forests that were being disturbed were selectively logged forests in Africa, in the Congo Basin, which are unfortunately also very understudied forests. Then down here, okay, so getting to those edge forests. Edge forests have somewhat lower complexity to begin with, so that's in green there. But what we're finding is that using this data set, an observed disturbance in the optical record in an edge doesn't actually result on average in very much complexity loss at all. And I think this is what we're seeing is that basically Landsat data, when it says there's a disturbance in an existing edge, it's sort of like the edge which was experiencing these low grade of disturbances over a long time has maybe tipped past some threshold that now gets it flagged up as degradation, but that actually when you measure the changes immediately that took place over the course of a year, it didn't correspond to very much change. It may well be, maybe we should account degradation as that difference in like what this edge has been experiencing over a longer time. But that disturbance is very, very different from if you're seeing a disturbance in the optical record that's in a logged area. Like these are two completely different types of change that are taking place. All right. Okay, so last little bit. So our third question was about whether there might be a correspondence between optical sensors and biomass loss that GEDI measures, because this would allow us to extrapolate from the sample. And I also think it could mark sort of a step change in optical disturbance detection, to be able to think about disturbance in the optical record, not just as a binary event, but as a spectrum of impacts, and to be able to report on disturbance in that way. So we looked at this one measure of disturbance intensity that can be derived from optical imagery alone, so just based on the Landsat record. It's based on a time series classification of pixels, and the intensity is quite simple. It really just corresponds to like how visible the disturbance was and for how long. So more visible disturbances and disturbances that last longer are more intense. And we found that this was pretty well correlated on average with percent biomass loss as measured by GEDI. And it also covers the full spectrum of impacts. So a very low disturbance intensity index you can see is like near zero biomass change. And then really high intensity actually, ends up tipping into near 100% biomass loss. So it's getting at that full spectrum. So where are we now? We started with this with traditional remote sensing methods. We were able to get at changes in canopy and cover that are associated with disturbance, and we were maybe just starting to get at biomass and carbon. With this work, I think we're able to quantify those biomass and carbon impacts much more concretely across space with associated uncertainties, and we can directly observe shifts in forest structure following disturbances of different types. We're obviously not all the way there in terms of bringing this all the way to think about function and health in forests, but I think we're starting to be able to bridge the gap between those two word clouds. And so I just want to spend a little time at the end talking about like what's next for GEDI and the GEDI team, and kind of where this work I hope can go next. So the GEDI sensor has been in hibernation mode for about 2 years now, but it is out of hibernation and is continuing to collect data. And with this data, we now have measurements with a 5-year time gap from the original data, which is super exciting. So a big part of our work now is on looking at change measurement without relying on an optical record intermediary, basically, but what can we say just from the GEDI data? And then I'm excited about looking at disturbances over time. So what do we see now that we have 5 years, maybe post-disturbance event? How much do we begin to see recovery in some areas? We are on the policy side. Like I mentioned, there's this active effort in the FAO to formalize and operationalize an international definition of degradation. Okay, there was supposed to be something in the middle here, which is that GEDI is coming out with version 3 data this summer, which is very exciting, which is going to reduce geolocation uncertainties and improve the biomass modeling. And then we're very excited that this EDGE mission just got approved by NASA, so it's fully funded. This is going to be there it is. Okay. GEDI version 3 data. Okay, a new Spaceborne Lidar mission called EDGE. EDGE is going to take over at the end of the International Space Station lifetime in 2030. It's going to be a swath LiDAR. So rather than taking these individual footprints, it's going to capture these like wide swaths of area. And it's also designed to have much more repeat data and with much greater coverage density than GEDI was able to achieve, because it's going to be on an independent satellite, not on the space station. It's going to have a sun synchronous orbit with seasonal repeats in the exact same locations, which is very exciting. And it will also reduce geolocation error to about 3 meters. I just like this timeline visualization mostly for an understanding of like the density of data. So GLASS, this early LiDAR system, we were just getting like a couple of measurements every now and again. Those were like photon returns. GEDI, we get some repeat, and EDGE is really designed to get significantly more data and to go back over the same places again and again, with prioritization of repeat footprints. And the next steps for kind of my research, I think, are looking at trying to integrate this better degradation monitoring into government, NGO, and private sector reporting. I think, and then we're also working with the groups that develop these disturbance systems. So for example, the JRC group and the Wageningen, the RAD group, to try to understand where GEDI disagrees with what they've seen, and says that there's actually this disturbance took place at a different time, or there was disturbance here that wasn't picked up, measuring the disturbances that might have missed. And then finally, I think as more GEDI data comes out, we want to move towards a much more integrated understanding of disturbance and regrowth. So not thinking about this as just one event that took place and now we're done, but rather like an ongoing pattern of losses and gains. And yeah, these are my final takeaways. Just as an Earth observation community, we're ready to move beyond thinking about disturbance as a binary event, a single loss of canopy cover, but using GEDI and other spaceborne LiDAR to help us understand disturbance as a complex and ongoing process in a way that is better aligned with policy goals and ecological reality. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions. Yeah.
Well, I have many questions, but I'll just go into one is if someone wants to do this analysis elsewhere, it's the GEDI team, aka you, providing some sort of data APIs infrastructure that we could use to find these repeat measurements, so we wouldn't have to repeat the repeat
Absolutely.
pipeline.
So this is my current project is like we want to publish this data basically. And so the biggest so the first thing that we've been working on is just like massively speeding up computationally the work that I did during my PhD to find these repeat footprints.
Right.
So we now have a system that's able to find them much more quickly than I was able to during my PhD, when it took about like 12 hours to find them over the whole Amazon, which is just way too long. So we're bringing that way down so that it could be an actual service where people could kind
you
of
specify a region of
my
interest and the times, and it just
Exactly.
gives you, ideally.
Yes,
the
and it would just
measurements.
give you this repeat footprint data. So, and I think the big thing there is just we're talking about like where to host this, and then we want to make sure that we always the thing with the GEDI data, get the quality filtering right in a way that matches what people are going to be trying to do with this data set. So I'm doing a bunch of kind of careful testing right now to, I did all of this with my version of quality filtering, and then I got to the GEDI team and I learned that like, oh, I guess I was supposed to do it this way. So just making sure that we're like getting all of those details exactly right. But yes, then we really want to publish this so anyone can kind of take any raster layer and kind of do this temporal lineup.
Yeah, cool. And my second question is, it seems that still one of our biggest limitations are optical sensors that we're going to be using to find where, because it's possible if an optical sensor, kind of in your case of Liana's, if it missed that, then we didn't even
exactly
look there.
Yes.
Right. So what are your thoughts on the future regarding that?
Yeah, so one of the collaborations that I'm working on right now is with the RAD group. So they're looking at Sentinel-1 data for disturbance detection, combined with Sentinel-2 often, but like looking at radar data basically as a way to get at some element of the structural change that's taking place. And that usually isn't able to quantify a structural change, but at least it's seeing something interacting maybe with like the top third of the canopy or so. That's understanding like what's happening there. They're also looking at much smaller disturbances. So I think what they're finding with their methods is that where JRC in some of these like logging areas in the Congo was finding, I hope the statistic is right, maybe like 30% of disturbances in these like 30-meter disturbances that they're picking up based on ground truth data. So I think those improvements will be one thing that makes a big difference. The other thing I think is interesting is like with GEDI, we're seeing we can say some things about sort of like, well, after, in this area, you're ending up with if a region has a sort of persistent bias in between the two footprints, this is an indication that there are losses that aren't being picked up in the optical record. And so trying to see where GEDI is disagreeing, like where you have canopy closure, but there is persistent difference in like forest stature or something like that, I think is one interesting, place to go with it.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
On the whole, from what you're saying about Sentinel-1, I had a chat with the other group from NASA. I don't know if you're friends from NICE.
Nice art. Yeah.
Because I feel like it would be way better because it's like
I'm supposed to talk up NICER. Yes.
Because they're meant to be a zero baseline star, which means that like they have a repeated orbit and then they will measure the same pixel in the same angle. I think one of the biggest problems with Sentinel-1 because they're measuring the pixels slightly different, right? So you cannot actually make backscattering time series because they're just like seeing different things. So I wonder if you have like any insights on that. And the other question was actually more a request. It's not to you yourself personally, but if there would be a way of getting a better implementation of the I think it's Hancock method for simulating the GEDI samples. Because honestly, I spent I think like a month trying to use that pipeline and like
are you using the Python one or are you using the older one?
The older one. I'm using.
So there is the team is very aware that that is an extremely brittle simulator.
Honestly, yes.
So it also for certain metrics like doesn't actually produce, so it's some metrics is correct and then for other metrics it was never actually calibrated on those metrics, so like don't be careful about using it for like for some of the PAI and foliage height diversity stuff. Yes, so there's a re-implementation in Python that I will like message me and I'll follow up when it's public, but they are actively working on that and trying to make sure that it actually matches up with the ALS data on all the metrics that it produces and not just some of them. So yes, agreed. And then wait, you mentioned, NICER. And so the two other things, which I should have said in response to your question too. So NICER is L-band, and then there's also the P-band biomass mission from ESA. So both of these, I think, are quite interesting for new radar specifically designed to look in forests and to detect changes there. And so I think both of these, so the biomass mission is going to have a disturbance product as one of its layers. It won't quantify change as far as I have been able to hear from them so far. But it will again be this like binary, yes, no, we think a disturbance happened here, that hopefully we could start to calibrate further with like, and then how intensive was that disturbance, things like that.
When is it coming up, the next one?
NICER is up.
No, it's up.
I'm not sure when I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. No.
Sorry, there was
Yeah, I have loads of questions. That was really interesting, but I'm just going to ask one.
Please.
So the thing that got me really excited was when you're talking about being able to look through time at recovery in selective logging, right? Which we know is operating over massive areas, and we don't really know the net consequences. But we expect that the like regeneration is going to be a big function of the amount of damage and biomass removed. So my question, I guess, is, do you have good measures of how intensive selective logging was? So like, because it varies massively, and then will you be able to see how the recovery through time varies within, not just looking selective logging, not selective logging, but as an amount of wood that was removed, what does that do to your recovery through time?
Yeah, so the way that we've been able to do this so far basically is, so you have these repeat footprint pairs. So that gives you like that gives you a pre-disturbance kind of calibration, right? And then you have different amounts of time since disturbance that the second GEDI footprint fell.
Yeah.
So you can do a bit of like space for time in that way, but that doesn't give you a three, like what you kind of would ideally want is like a 3 footprint set.
Yeah.
So depending on the area of the world, GEDI, in some areas, GEDI has enough repeats to give you like a 3 footprint set before, after, sometime later.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in the tropics, so basically the GEDI footprints are really concentrated at northern and southern latitudes near 51, plus 51, minus 51 degrees. So like in logging in like Canada and things like that, we are actually a little bit lower. So like that bottom bit of Canada, we see things like that. You can see it in Russia. We can see it in the northern US. So actually like Oregon, for example, very well covered.
Yeah.
In the tropics, we don't have enough data from that right now. EDGE would allow us to do something like that. GEDI, maybe in a little bit, but I think we're unlikely to get enough samples of repeats, especially because now the GEDI group, now we've been able to prioritize spreading out the samples so that like repeat footprint treasure trove has diminished quite a lot.
That would be so interesting because basically all the logging companies claim that they're having an even rate of recovery through time. But exactly like you're saying, like you go into some of these forests that have been selectively logged 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And maybe in the first few years have a burst of growth, but then they're like the lianas come in, and you can even see these hump shapes and this like long-term carbon decline in some of these logging areas.
So we see some of this. So I think some of it, even just with the space for time of like, well, here's what it was before, and then here's footprints that were 3 months later versus 6 months later versus 12 months later versus something else. Though I think more what we're seeing is that there's subsequent initial damage in the first little bit after the first disturbance. You see additional losses and additional losses, and then we see the beginnings of some recovery. But with just this data set, we've only got 3 years of data, so we're not seeing longer term trends. But I think with the 5-year data, so we're looking at some selective logging areas in the Congo basin, and that's kind of going to be our first test of whether. So that's where we have ground truth data from logging concessions. Yeah. So I think that's going to be our first test. And I'm like still running that data right now.
And that data doesn't need to just have the event in the middle, right? Because you can imagine if you knew a place was logged 10 years ago, and then you have 2 repeat points, you have still the measure in time, and you can see like, has logging 10 years ago, are you actually getting an increase, or have you got this kind of decline? And I would expect in some places, especially in where the logging is really intensive in Southeast Asia, you would see that even 10, 15 years after logging, you're not getting this like linear growth that the logging companies claim they have, because you have huge areas in arrested succession.
That would be, I think, super interesting. Yes, I think that's a great point. Like, I think looking at even long prior disturbed and just looking at these recovery trajectories. Can we put?
Anyway, I do want to stop here.
Oh, yes, okay.
A little bit past this.
Sorry.
Right. Thanks so much. Maybe I'm going to stop the recording now and